All right, so this video is the second half of lecture 13. And in this part of the video, I'm going to introduce you to two different types of statistical tests that you can use when your dependent variable is categorical. Okay, and the two types of tests we're going to learn are the binomial test and the chi-squared test. And I just want to say, over the next couple of lectures, we're going to learn a bunch of different types of tests. It's not exhaustive. We're kind of learning some really fundamental and simple ones. But this is the part of the course that really builds on what you learned before. And so you really have to keep up with the material. If you struggled with skills during the first half of the course, this is where it's really going to become challenging for you. So, for example, thinking about types of tests, it's important to understand types of data. Okay, so the first type we're going to cover today is the binomial test. The binomial test is used to compare a proportion with a specific expected value. So the data for a binomial test is a single categorical variable, and the variable must have two mutually exclusive levels, and the data are assumed to come from a random sample. That's true of all the statistical tests we're going to be covering. In fact, it's always true. So examples of questions that can be addressed with a binomial test, well, we saw a bunch of them in the previous lecture when we were looking at sex ratios at birth, for example. But here are some other ones that I just made up. So you might be interested in whether frogs are equally likely to be right or left-handed. So you've got this one variable, handedness of these frogs, and you might run a binomial test to see whether the proportion right-handed differs from 50%. Another example might be asking whether the sex ratio at birth is half male and half female, or whether it differs from that 50-50 ratio. And yet another example, it doesn't have to be a 50% rate, proportion, right? Another example could be, we might want to know if we crossbreed a round pea plant with a wrinkled pea plant, and we look at the offspring in their offspring generation, we might want to know whether the phenotypes in the offspring generation differ from a 3-to-1 ratio of round to wrinkled, or in other words, is there a difference from 75% round? Okay, so I want to show you what the data would look like, because I think that really helps make sense of what we're doing here. So for each of these three kind of hypothetical examples, I've made a little snippet of a spreadsheet here showing you like hypothetical data, right? So we've got, for the frog question, for each of our frogs in our study, we've measured their handedness somehow. And then for the sex ratio question, we've measured the sex at birth for a bunch of people. And then for the pea study, like we've got all these pea plants in our offspring generation, and we've evaluated their phenotypes. So in each case, we've got this single categorical variable, the one on the far right of each of these little spreadsheets, and we're evaluating whether the proportion, the sample proportion, significantly differs from some expected proportion. That's what the binomial test is doing. So we can ask, what is the null hypothesis for each of the tests that we would be describing above? And that's what I've laid out on this slide. You should be able, on a test or exam, to kind of work through these steps on your own for a new example. Okay, so what is the test statistic for a binomial test? It's just the observed proportion, the sample proportion. And the p-value is calculated using something called the binomial distribution, which is a probability distribution for categorical variables that have two levels. In other words, binary variables like heads or tails, correct, incorrect, male, female, wrinkled, round. The binomial test lets us ask whether the sample proportion is consistent with the null expectation. And here's an example from a scientific study. In this study, radiologists, who are doctors who work with radiation like x-rays, have suspected for a while that they tend to have more daughters than sons. So this study set out to test this by collecting data on the offspring of male radiologists. And the researchers collected data on 87 children of male radiologists in Japan And they found that of these 87, 30 were male. And so we can assume that this is a random sample, although truly almost no samples are truly random. But the question is, here's the data. 30 of the 87 children are male. Does this observed proportion differ significantly from our null hypothesis of 50% male? So we can do a binomial test to answer that question. So our main hypothesis is that the proportion of male children is different from 0.5. Our null hypothesis is that the proportion of male children is 0.5. And when you use your statistical software like R, you plug in these data, you can get a p-value of 0.005, and your descriptive statistic is, you can report it as just the proportion 30 divided by 87, which is 0.35. And you can report your sample size as well. So what would you conclude? You can reject the null hypothesis. The male radiologists in this sample had significantly more daughters than expected. So just a note, where does this p-value come from? I showed you some examples yesterday where I calculated the p-values by hand. In practice, you never do that, although it's useful to see that done. In practice, your software, such as R or Python, you'll have software packages that do that for you. And I just want to mention that it's been shown that other forms of radiation, like nuclear fallout, can shift the sex ratio at birth in humans. Okay, so now let's move on to the second type of test we're going to cover. And again, this is a type of test when your dependent variable is a categorical variable. And this is the chi-squared test of independence, and it's also called the chi-squared contingency test. This test evaluates whether there is an association between two categorical variables. In the chi-squared test, you can have, the variables can have more than two levels, but the categories or the levels within any one variable have to be mutually exclusive. And so in other words, an individual in your sample can't belong to more than one category for a given variable. And so what I mean by that is, like, if one of your variables is hair color and you've got categories of like black, brown, blonde, red, you can't have a person who has both, like, I don't know, brown hair and red hair. They have to be assigned to one category. As usual, the data are assumed to come from a random sample. And here are some examples of questions that can be addressed with a chi-squared test. Do orange or brown butterflies differ in the probability of getting eaten? So in this question, there are two categorical variables. We've got the categorical variable of the butterfly's color, and we've got the categorical variable of, did it get eaten or not? Here's another one. Are smokers more likely to drink than non-smokers? So again, buried in this question, we've got two categorical variables. We've got a person's whether or not they smoke, and we've got whether or not they drink. And a third one is, are heart attacks less likely among people who are prescribed some newly invented drug? So again, here we've got these two variables, taking this drug or not, and having had a heart attack or not. Okay, so again, we can write down the null hypothesis for each of these hypothetical examples. And so the null hypothesis is just that there's no relationship between the two variables, or that the probability of the Y outcome is unrelated to X. And so you could say something like, the probability of being eaten is independent of whether a butterfly is orange or brown. Smokers are just as likely to drink as non-smokers. Taking the drug does not affect the probability of a heart attack. So these are different ways of saying the same thing, just to kind of show you the diversity of ways that these things can be phrased. Here's an example of what the data would look like for these hypothetical chi-squared tests. So on the top, we've got our butterfly spreadsheet, and the variables to focus on are the two on the right, right? So for each butterfly, we've got its color, that's one of our categorical variables, and whether or not the butterfly got eaten in our study. And so that's our other variable. And so we're interested in whether there's a relationship between those two variables. And on the bottom, same idea. It's just our heart attack study. Each row is one of the people in our study, and we've identified like, were they taking the new drug or were they not taking the drug, and like what happened with them in terms of whether they had a heart attack or not. So as a nice bit of practice, can you draw what the spreadsheet would look like for the middle example? Okay, so the test statistic for a chi-squared test is chi-squared, and that's the symbol. It's this kind of fancy looking X, and it's based on computing the expected values in a contingency table that you would expect to get if the two variables were independent. In other words, the null hypothesis. I'm going to show you how that gets calculated. It's useful to know how to kind of see what that is, but in practice, software does this stuff for us. So once you or your software has calculated chi-squared, the p-value is determined by comparing the observed chi-squared statistic with the distribution of values expected under the null hypothesis. And the chi-squared test allows us to ask whether one categorical variable is related to or dependent on another one. Excuse me. Okay, so I'm going to show you that with an example here, and just focusing on what do I mean by independence. And the example I'm going to use is real data from the Titanic shipwreck that happened in the year 1914. So this big pioneering ship tragically sank, and many people died. And we have data from the people who died and people who survived, and whether they were men or women. And so we can ask the question, was there any difference in the probability of survival for men and women passengers involved in this disaster? So what I'm showing on top is the contingency table of the data. And I can make that into a mosaic plot, and that's what I'm showing on the bottom left here. So you can see represented by these colored squares, the kind of size or area of the color represents the quantities involved. And so you can see, first of all, that there were more men passengers than women passengers. And second of all, you can see a large proportion of the passengers died. But right away, you can see that the proportion that died was higher among men passengers than it was among women. So we can ask the question, is this difference statistically significant? Is there an association between a person's gender and whether or not they survived in this disaster? Now, here's what the mosaic plot would look like if we had a scenario of independence, right? If gender had nothing to do with survival, we might see something like this. There's lots of other ways this could look, but the point is the proportion that survived is equivalent in the two groups. Now, any one sample, we're going to have variation in those proportions. So what we want to use the test to ask is whether the observed difference on the left is so improbable under the null that we can reject the null. Okay, so how is the chi-squared statistic calculated? This slide is going to walk you through that. So we've got our observed contingency table on the top left, and then I've created a contingency table with the same sample size, but that corresponds to the null hypothesis of independence. And so both of these tables have the same total sum of 2,092 passengers. They both have the same column sums, so they have the same ratio of men and women, and they both have the same row sums, so they have the same ratio of survived and died. And so if the two variables are independent, it means that the state of one is not related to the probability of outcome on the other. So what we do to get chi-squared is we take our two tables here, and for each of the cells, we do a subtraction, right? So we find the difference between like 338 and 522, for example. We find the difference between 316 and 133. And we take those differences and we square them. That makes them all positive. And we divide them by the expected value. And then we take the sum of all the cells in the table. And in this case, we get a chi-squared of 460. And with your software, you can calculate that that gives you a p-value for this chi-squared test of p less than 0.0001. And so we reject the null hypothesis. Indeed, there is a significant difference in the probability of survival for men and women on the Titanic. And it's probably because at that time, there were kind of social norms about who would be go into the rescue boats first, for example. Okay, so let's look at a chi-square test for the polio vaccine. So we saw these data in the previous lecture as well. So you can apply the same procedure and you calculate a chi-squared of 45.8, a p-value less than 0.001. And so you can conclude, therefore, the vaccine caused a significant decrease in the incidence of polio in children. And here's one more example. This is a study that we saw in a previous lecture. It's a meta-analysis of several studies in the field of nutrition research. And so this meta-analysis asked whether a study's funding source was associated with the type of conclusion it came to. And in particular, was getting your funding from industry, did that influence whether or not the study came to a favorable conclusion about a particular food, like, I don't know, potato chips or chocolate, versus an unfavorable conclusion about a particular food? And so it's not a huge sample size of studies here. It's much smaller than the two previous examples. But we can take this contingency table and we can run a chi-squared test. Our null hypothesis is that the conclusion of a study is independent of its funding source. And our chi-squared statistic is 5.2, and our p-value here is 0.02, which is less than our alpha threshold, and so we'd reject the null hypothesis. Now, one more thing you should know. There's another requirement for the chi-squared test that I didn't tell you at the beginning, just in the interest of clarity. And the other requirement is that the expected frequencies when assuming the null can't be too small. And so a common practice is that if your contingency table has cells with values fewer than 5, then you shouldn't be doing a chi-squared test. So for example, here's an imaginary contingency table. We've got our x variable, we've got our y variable, and we've got a few cells here that have values less than 5. And so we shouldn't be using a chi-squared test for this analysis. Now I bring this up here because the example of that study of nutrition studies, it also violates this assumption. We had one of the cells had a value of 0, but just in the interest of the lecture, we'll assume that it's okay to run that chi-squared test. Now, if you have a data set where you can't run a chi-squared test for this reason, there are other types of tests for categorical data, but we're not going to cover them in this course. I just put them up on the slide to let you know, like, what we're covering in this course is just the tip of the iceberg. There's many other techniques. The purpose of what we're learning here is to kind of teach you the logic of statistical thinking as a form of evidence. Okay, so another practice question. So given that we've got these data and we ran this test and we rejected the null hypothesis, and again, just assume that it was okay to run the chi-squared test in this case. So what I want you to identify is which of the following interpretations here, A, B, C, D, E, are correct. Excuse me. So choose all of the options here that are correct interpretations given the information at the top of the slide. So that's it for this lecture. This last slide is intended to be a study aid, and it summarizes the features of the binomial test and chi-squared contingency test that you'll be expected to know. And I'll see you all on Thursday.